In the icy grips of the Russian winter of 1943, the German High Command, reeling from their crushing defeat at Stalingrad, faced a monumental decision: to launch one of the largest armored offensives in history at Kursk, or to retreat and consolidate. What followed was a heated internal debate that would decide the fate of the Eastern Front. As the last German aircraft lifted off from the icy grips of the Stalingrad encirclement in early February 1943, it left behind a staggering 91,000 demoralized soldiers to Soviet captivity. The Sixth Army, once a formidable force under General Friedrich Paulus, was reduced to a shadow of its former self, marking a pivotal shift in World War II's Eastern Front. The Battle of Stalingrad, lasting from August 1942 to February 1943, had not only halted the German advance, but had also inflicted irrevocable losses with over 800,000 Axis casualties reported. The psychological blow to the German military and Nazi leadership was profound. Adolf Hitler, who had previously declared that the German army would never retreat from Stalingrad, was faced with one of his most glaring defeats. The news of the surrender was met with disbelief and horror back in Germany, and the state-controlled media scrambled to manage the narrative. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, albeit critical of the decision to not attempt a breakout, was now faced with the monumental task of stabilizing a rapidly disintegrating front line. Morale among the German troops plummeted as the stark reality of the Eastern War became undeniable. Soldiers who had once believed in a swift victory now faced the grim prospects of endless warfare and mounting casualties. The psychological impact was captured in letters home and diary entries, with troops describing a palpable sense of abandonment and disillusionment. General Paulus, now a prisoner of war, lamented in a letter dated March 5, 1943. The capitulation of Stalingrad is a catastrophe of the first magnitude for Germany, a catastrophe of material and of moral import. Strategically, the Wehrmacht was now on the defensive. The defeat had opened up the southern flank to Soviet advances, and the German High Command had to hastily redraw battle lines that had been stable for months. This situation set the stage for heated debates within the German military leadership on the future course of the war in the East. While some advocated for a strategic withdrawal to regroup and replenish, others, buoyed by Hitler's obsession with not yielding an inch of territory, pushed for an all-out offensive to regain the initiative. The decision-making process was fraught with tension and urgency. Hitler, increasingly distrustful of his general's advice, insisted on a show of force to reclaim lost prestige and momentum. This culminated in the decision to launch Operation Citadel, the largest armored offensive planned on the Eastern Front, targeting the Soviet salient at Kursk. Despite reservations from his military advisors about the readiness and potential risks, Hitler believed that a decisive blow at Kursk could turn the tide of the war tide back in favor of the Axis powers. As preparations for Kursk began, the Wehrmacht rushed to replenish its depleted ranks and equipment. Thousands of new tanks and artillery pieces were produced, and divisions were refitted, often at the cost of other strategic fronts. The pressure to deliver a victory was immense, both to restore the morale of the German forces and to stabilize the increasingly precarious situation on the Eastern Front. The aftermath of Stalingrad had thus not only reshaped the German military outlook, but had also set the stage for one of the war's most significant battles. With the Wehrmacht's morale and capability at an all-time low, the High Command's decision to engage at Kursk was not just a strategic choice, but a desperate bid to regain the upper hand in a war that was progressively consuming Germany. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either restore German confidence or lead further into the abyss of military defeat. The collapse at Stalingrad in February 1943 had left the German High Command grappling with the question, what next? In the shadow of this devastating defeat, heated debates and strategic recalculations dominated discussions among Germany's top brass. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, a proponent of aggressive action, argued vehemently for a strike at Kursk. Located in southwestern Russia, Kursk was a salient that bulged into German lines, presenting a tempting target. Manstein believed that a swift, decisive attack could encircle and destroy significant Soviet forces, potentially tipping the Eastern Front's balance back in Germany's favor. Contrasting Manstein's hawkish stance, General Heinz Guderian, inspector of the panzer troops, voiced staunch opposition. Guderian, fresh from the wounds of Stalingrad, argued that the Wehrmacht needed time to recover. He stressed reconsolidating and strengthening Germany's defenses rather than launching another potentially catastrophic offensive. Guderian's caution was echoed by others who feared that the Soviets' growing strength, fueled by increasing industrial output and Allied support, would make any attack risky. In a meeting dated March 1943, Guderian pointedly told Hitler, "The thought of attacking at Kursk is to operate an already infected appendix." The strategic options laid before Adolf Hitler were stark. On one side, the allure of cutting off the Kursk salient was tempting. It promised to be a surgical strike that could reignite momentum on the Eastern Front. On the other, the conservative approach aimed at fortification and defense, allowing the battered Wehrmacht forces to recuperate. Hitler, ever the gambler and swayed by his belief in the Wehrmacht's invincibility, leaned towards Manstein's plan. The discussions were intense and exhaustive, with several rounds of debates involving key figures like Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, and Hermann Hoth, another panzer commander. As April turned to May, the tug-of-war within the High Command continued. Intelligence reports, such as those from the German reconnaissance units, indicated a significant buildup of Soviet forces around Kursk. This should have served as a cautionary signal, yet it paradoxically convinced Hitler of the need to attack before the Soviets could fully fortify their positions. By late May 1943, Hitler had made up his mind. He issued Directive Number 6, ordering preparations for Operation Citadel, the code name for the assault on Kursk. The plan was to pinch off the Kursk salient using a pincer movement from the north and the south, focusing the bulk of Germany's panzer divisions in a massive all-out assault. The decision was fraught with peril. As the plans for Citadel were being finalized, voices within the High Command continued to express doubts. Accounts from participants in these meetings describe a palpable tension, with frequent outbursts of frustration from both advocates and detractors of the plan. Guderian's final plea to Hitler in June, as recalled in his memoirs, was prophetic. "My Führer, make peace," he implored, sensing the impending disaster. Yet, the wheels of military machinery, once set in motion, proved difficult to halt. Despite the divergent views within the command, the decision had crystallized. The stage was set for what would become one of the largest and most brutal tank battles in history. As troops massed and tanks rolled towards their starting positions, the air was heavy with both anticipation and dread. The Battle of Kursk was not just another military operation. It was a gamble on which the fate of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the war itself, hung precariously in balance. As troops massed and tanks rolled towards their starting positions, the air was heavy with both anticipation and dread. The Battle of Kursk was not just another military operation. It was a gamble on which the fate of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the war itself, hung precariously in balance. By June 1943, the German High Command, under Adolf Hitler's insistence, orchestrated Operation Citadel with the objective to encircle and annihilate the Soviet forces at the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Eastern Front that extended 150 kilometers wide and 160 kilometers deep into German-held territory. The planning of Operation Citadel was a monumental task spearheaded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and General Heinz Guderian, who both advocated for a swift and massive thrust. Guderian, in particular, emphasized the need for surprise and speed, stating, "We must strike like lightning. The quicker the action, the better the results." The German forces amassed for this offensive were formidable: 780,000 men, about 10,000 artillery guns, and a staggering 2,700 tanks, including the new Panther and Tiger tanks, designed to counter the robust Soviet T-34. Technological and tactical innovations were at the forefront of German preparations. The introduction of the Panther tank was particularly notable, symbolizing a significant leap in armored warfare. However, these tanks were rushed to the front with several mechanical issues due to Hitler's urgency, a fact often lamented by the tank crews. Otto Carius, a tank commander at Kursk, recalled, "Many of our Panthers were lost not to the enemy, but to engine fires and mechanical failures." Despite these setbacks, the German military also deployed the Ferdinand tank destroyer, boasting an armor that could withstand most Soviet anti-tank weapons. Conversely, the Soviet side, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky, was not idle. Soviet intelligence, through their espionage networks and signals interception, had learned of the German buildup and their likely axis of attack. This allowed the Soviets to prepare a deeply echeloned defense system, known as the Kursk defensive belt, comprising multiple layers of minefields, anti-tank ditches, and fortified zones manned by over 1 million troops, which effectively turned the Kursk region into a fortress. Zhukov, emphasizing the importance of readiness, declared, "We had time to prepare, and we used it to the utmost." As the clock ticked down to the launch of Operation Citadel, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army were on a collision course of unprecedented scale. Historians note that never before had such concentrations of military power been assembled. The air was thick with tension as both sides understood what was at stake. The German assault on the morning of July 5, 1943, began with a massive artillery barrage, followed by waves of panzers rolling into the Soviet defenses. The ferocity of the German attack initially stunned the Soviet front lines, but the depth and resilience of the Soviet fortifications began to grind the German advance to a halt. Field reports from the German side spoke of a hell of fire and steel, where every meter gained was paid for in blood. One poignant account by a young German soldier, Hans Becker, encapsulates the horror. Each advance was a nightmare of screaming shells and earth-shattering explosions. I saw friends disappear in clouds of smoke, never to rise again. As the Wehrmacht massed its panzers and the Red Army fortified its positions, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would echo through history. This titanic clash, fueled by meticulous planning, cutting-edge technology, and sheer human grit, was not merely a battle, but a defining moment on the Eastern Front, showcasing the grim determination and immense sacrifices of both forces engaged in the heart of Russia. On July 4, 1943, the eve of the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history loomed ominously. Across the rolling plains of Kursk, the German forces under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein marshaled their resources, amassing nearly 800,000 men, 2,700 tanks, and over 2,000 aircraft. This was Operation Citadel, a massive offensive designed to pinch off the Kursk salient with a pincer movement from the north and south. The atmosphere among the German troops was tense. Years of war had hardened them, yet the scars of Stalingrad were still fresh, imbuing a mix of dread and determination in their ranks. As final hours ticked by, German commanders reviewed their strategies. Intelligence reports highlighted the formidable Soviet defenses: dense minefields, vast anti-tank ditches, and deeply echeloned fortified zones. Yet, some among the German command, like Colonel General Heinz Guderian, opposed the attack, arguing that the initiative had already been lost and that Soviet preparations would guarantee a bloody stalemate. Despite these objections, Hitler, obsessed with a decisive victory to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front, pushed forward. In the quiet before the storm, soldiers from the elite Grossdeutschland division penned letters home or murmured prayers. A young lieutenant, Karl Heinrich, recorded in his diary, "The air feels heavy with fate. We are the sword's edge, yet I fear the scabbard is worn." These poignant words captured the apprehension felt by many at the front line. The men knew the Soviets were waiting, reinforced and ready, their numbers overwhelming. The scale of the impending conflict was unlike any they had previously faced. The Luftwaffe, crucial to the German strategy, prepared for an extensive aerial campaign to achieve air superiority before the ground forces engaged. Major Walter Nowotny, an ace pilot, remarked in a letter, "Tomorrow we dance with the devil over Kursk. Our engines and guns, our steel against their resolve, the air crews checked and rechecked their machines, understanding that the success of Operation Citadel hinged on their performance in the coming days." Meanwhile, adjustments to the initial plans were rapidly made. Real-time reconnaissance pointed out stronger than expected Soviet fortifications at key points, prompting hurried discussions among the staff officers. Maps were redrawn and target priorities shifted, with a particular emphasis on disrupting Soviet command and control centers. Field Marshal von Manstein himself oversaw these adjustments, often working without rest, driven by a relentless pursuit of victory and the haunting pressure to avoid another Stalingrad. As darkness enveloped the German camps on the night of July 4th, soldiers gripped their weapons, silent prayers mixing with the soft clink of gear. They were the spearhead of an operation that Hitler believed would turn the tide of the war. Yet, each man bore the weight of uncertainty, their thoughts a tangle of fear, duty, and the hope of survival. With strategies laid and troops in place, the fateful day arrived, bringing with it a battle of unprecedented scale and ferocity. The dawn of July 5th would not only see the unleashing of a colossal clash of tanks and troops, but would test the mettle of every soldier who stepped onto that vast battlefield. As engines roared to life and commanders issued their final orders, the Eastern Front braced for a confrontation that would echo through the annals of war, a pivotal moment where strategy, courage, and terror would collide in the heart of Russia. On July 5, 1943, the fields near Prokhorovka echoed with the sound of over 2,000 German and Soviet tanks clashing in one of the largest armored engagements in history. The German offensive, codenamed Operation Citadel, had commenced with a devastating barrage of artillery that pummeled the Soviet defensive lines at dawn. Luftwaffe squadrons surged overhead, diving through anti-aircraft fire to strike at the reeling Soviet positions. The Wehrmacht's goal, to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, aiming to regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front after their defeat at Stalingrad. The ferocity of the German attack was met with a meticulously prepared Soviet defense. The Soviets had spent months fortifying the region with minefields, anti-tank ditches, and dense networks of trenches and bunkers, turning Kursk into a fortress that would bleed the German forces white. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, overseeing the Soviet strategy, had predicted the exact locations of the German thrusts, allowing the Red Army to concentrate their resources effectively. Soviet soldiers, entrenched within their deep defensive lines, unleashed a withering hail of fire on the advancing panzers. The battle's first days were marked by brutal tank-on-tank combat. German Tiger tanks, with their superior armor and firepower, initially caused considerable havoc among the Soviet armored brigades. However, the Soviets' numerical superiority and tactical ingenuity began to tell. Soviet T-34 tanks, more maneuverable and produced in far greater numbers, swarmed the German spearheads, often engaging in deadly close-quarters battles. Tank commander Dmitry Lavrinenko, recognized posthumously as a hero of the Soviet Union, accounted for 52 German tanks before his death in combat during these initial clashes. His story, often recounted in veteran memoirs, highlights the personal valor that punctuated this gigantic clash of metal and men. Amidst this chaos of steel and fire, the human cost was staggering. The air was thick with the smoke of burning tanks and the screams of wounded men. Field reports from both sides describe a hellscape where the ground itself seemed to shudder under constant artillery bombardment. A German soldier, Friedrich Kellner, noted in his diary, "We advanced through a landscape of fire and steel, where every step forward cost the blood of our comrades." The Soviets, too, bore their share of agony and heroism, as young soldiers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the famed female sniper, held their ground against the tide, adding to her tally of 309 confirmed kills. By the time the dust settled on these initial days of the Battle of Kursk, the landscape bore witness to a graveyard of men and machines. The Germans had gained some ground, but at a cost that far exceeded their most pessimistic forecasts. The Soviets had absorbed the initial shock and were beginning to mount counteroffensives. The German High Command, already wary of their extended supply lines and the growing might of the Allied forces in the West, found themselves questioning the prudence of their gamble at Kursk. The outcome of this monumental battle was still to be decided, but as the first week drew to a close, it was clear that Kursk would be remembered not just for the scale of its engagement, but for the indomitable spirit of the defenders and the fatal hubris of the attackers. As the dust settled on the first days of battle, the fate of the Eastern Front hung in the balance, with both sides poised for the grueling conflicts yet to come. From the depths of defeat at Stalingrad to the thunderous clashes at Kursk, the German decision to attack was fraught with controversy and desperation. This monumental battle not only shaped the course of the Eastern Front, but also underscored the limits of blitzkrieg against a well-prepared adversary. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more fascinating historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.